never held a microphone while I spoke, so this could be a bit of a gymnastics thing here. I'm going to talk today about the first 50 years of Catholicism in Mexico, and this is known as the Primitive Church era, from 1524 to 1574. It's so named because it resembles the first 2 decades of Christianity in Europe. Imagine a blank landscape, lots of opportunity to preach, nobody but disciples running around the landscape. As you know, the Aztecs are a series of lineages that all claim descent from a homeland called Aztlan, and all of them left Aztlan and headed southward. We don't know where Aztlan is. We have some ideas, but anyway, moved southward, and many of them dropped out along the way in the states of Zacatecas and Hidalgo, and went on down to Tlaxcala and Puebla. Those Aztec lineages you know as Chichimecs, Tarascans over in Michoacan, the Otomi, Huichol, and then down onto to the right of the basin of Mexico in the south, we have the Cholulans and the Tlaxcaltecans and some others. Some of the groups went on down into the basin of Mexico, such as the Xochimilco and the Mexica. The most famous of these groups are the Mexica, and they're the ones who are generally referred to as the Aztecs. As the Aztecs migrated, as the Mexica migrated southward, they left Aztlan last. And as they migrated southward, they went through their, sorry, yes, I've got to learn to do all of this, okay. They went through various kin groups and adopted from the Huastec, which are actually not an Aztec group, but adopted from the Huastec and then from the Otomis and the Chichimecs several ceremonies and cults that you may know them for. For instance, the cult of the new fire, the cult of all the pulque gods, the cult of the arrow sacrifice, the cult of Quetzalcoatl, the cult of Zipitotec, and deities related to cotton, as well as adopting the solar calendar and the double pyramid style. When they got on down into the basin of Mexico, the Mexica were influenced by other groups that were there, including other kin-related Aztec groups, and there they adopted the Tlaloc cult, agriculture, and cults of various corn deities. By the mid-15th century, the basin of Mexico was ruled by 3 city-states. One of these was Tenochtitlan, the Mexica capital, and under the center of Mexico City today. The Mexica capital of Tenochtitlan was larger than any city in Europe at the time. The Mexica had a full solar calendar, festival solar calendar, and a professional priesthood, as well as written documents and social stratification exactly like that in Europe. Elite lineages, elite communities. In 1454, after 3 years of alternating drought and floods, the Mexica high priest elevated the deity of Huitzilopochtli and its cult, known for human sacrifices, to be the principal Mexica deity, and ordered a tripling of the human sacrifices in order to bring the weather problems to an end. Whereas Tlaloc and numerous other deities were the cults of the farmers, Huitzilopochtli was the cult for the elite. Within the 18 20-day festivals of the solar year, there were only 3 to Huitzilopochtli in 1521, reflecting his newcomer status. The 15th century for Spanish Catholics was even more eventful. Now, I'm talking about the centuries before the 2 groups meet, okay? The 15th century for Spanish Catholics was even more eventful than what I've just told you for the Mexica. Official doctrine expanded to include the adoption of the Rosary, the adoption of purgatory, of indulgences, of the Immaculate Conception of Mary inside her mother Anne, and saw an explosion of popular cults of Mary, often in the form of apparitions, such as Our Lady of Guadalupe, which reappeared in Spain in the 1300s. In the late 1400s, many Spanish church leaders believed that Christ's return would occur in the 16th century, and that a Spanish king would be the restorer of Jerusalem. And that moved from Charles V to Philip II, and then they gave up on that idea. And they also believed that the Pope would be the Antichrist. Columbus believed it was his mission to secure the wealth needed for the restoration of Jerusalem and to open up an avenue for all the unbaptized of the world to be baptized before the second coming. That brings us to 1517 and the start of a rebellion by German Catholics. Many of the complaints raised by Martin Luther had been circulating among European Catholics for decades and even centuries. With the discovery of the New World, Spanish Catholics in particular settled on a new possibility for getting it right, for creating a pure Catholicism free from all the complaints that Martin Luther had raised, and many of them shared. Spain itself would not permit any other religion in its boundaries until the 20th century, and Latin America would become the greatest Catholic success. Cortez embarked overland in 1519 from the coast of Veracruz. Next one, sorry. This is the first chapel that he built in La Antigua, Veracruz. You can still see his home, a temporary home, and this chapel if you go to La Antigua in Veracruz. Next. Throughout the journey, the groups that Cortez met and then subdued saw him and the Spaniards as liberators from the hated Mexica. The attitude among Native Americans, whether they're in Mexico or North America or South America, the attitude among Native American elites was that one should have as the principal patron of the lineage the most powerful deity. For many of these lineages, it was at the time of contact Mishkawat, the old fire god. As the Spaniards subdued the Totonacs, then the Tlaxcaltecans, and then the mighty Mexica, elites were eager to adopt the god of the Spaniards. And you see here in this Tlacopan was one of the Triple Alliance cities in the basin of Mexico. And you see here this symbolism of the Tlatoani, the king of Tlacopan, embracing Christianity, wading out into the water and embracing Christianity. The hole in the globe signifies the incomplete baptism of the world's peoples. Go to the next one. And here you see the Tlatoanis of the various different groups that you know of, like the Totonacs and the Mexica and the Mixtecs and the Zapotecs and many other groups holding the flags of their various dioceses. They reportedly were quite worried about getting the prayers and the ritual action correct. Many anthropological interviews with native ritual specialists or their audiences say that the understanding is not important, that the deity expects to hear a rhythm and sounds and smoke and things. So it doesn't matter that you understand what you're doing. It doesn't matter that you understand what the new God, what you're saying. You need to understand what the God wants. And these elite native peoples expressed a lot of concern to the Spanish missionaries. Were they getting it? You know, the Catholics are worried about getting it right, and the native peoples are worried about getting it right too. The first step to baptism for Franciscans, Dominicans, and Augustinians, starting in 1524, was, and this is a period of perforce of adult baptism, was to get everybody legally married, church married, not legally, but church married, so that they could then be baptized. And that they required then that in these polygynous elite families, that the elite male choose one woman to be his wife and send away all the others. There are reports of many elites moving beyond the reach of the missionaries so that they didn't have to do this. Nevertheless, thousands of couples, sometimes whole lineages, were married, then baptized in a weekend in some missions. The missionaries applied a centuries-old Catholic expansion strategy of establishing the main church in the largest native city and calling that a doctrina. And then in secondary tribute cities to that larger city, they would establish visitas that had to be visited at least once a month by the missionaries. Or better yet, forcing the native communities to relocate to someplace much more convenient to the missionaries. And they would force them to move by burning down their villages. Both Aztecs, creating new communities that the native peoples built themselves. They built the towns and they built the churches. Creating these new communities was called reductions or congregation programs, and the last one of these ended in 1602. Both Aztecs and Catholics experienced religion through cult membership. This is a major aspect of the assimilation of Catholicism in Mexico and elsewhere in the New World. Franciscans had cults in the form of brotherhoods to different advocations of Mary, particularly the Immaculate Conception, as well as San Miguel and San Francisco. Dominicans favored Dominic and the Rosary. Both Aztecs and Catholics had professional celibate priesthoods with required schooling and with acolytes. A religious festival calendar with participation required of the populace, a covenant with a patron deity, shrines, processions, religious songs, dances, and music, secret religious knowledge, and a remote religious language. Both cultures awaited an imminent apocalyptic ending. Both had the sacraments of baptism from the same idea of filth at birth, communion, and confession. For instance, confession. Confession was practiced by many Native American groups throughout the Americas long before the Spanish showed up. Mexica held confessional events twice a year. In front of Xochiquetzal's image, people pierced their tongues once for each of their regrets or sadnesses, and a priest collected the thorns and then burned them. The penitents then took a ritual bath and ate maize dough with honey, which represented the body of the goddess of Xochiquetzal. Next slide. Professional priests and trainees confessed and did penance daily. Once in a lifetime, one could confess before the goddess Tlazolteotl for drunkenness, a capital crime if committed a second time or not confessed. The difference between the native rite of confession and that introduced by the Catholics was, of course, for the Catholics, there was a never-ending list of sins for which you never got to stop confessing, right? For both groups, confession preceded penance. The Franciscans in New Spain introduced weekly confession for church-married natives in 1526, 2 years after arriving, quizzing them on the Articles of Faith, the 10 Commandments, 7 moral sins, the Pater Noster, Ave Maria, the Creed, the Salve Regina, all, of course, in a foreign language. Next, confessional manuals were quickly prepared in native picture conventions and were, go back one, I think. Yes. In native picture conventions, and were often created to probe the kinds of sinful activities the natives were continuing. One confessional manual had 180 questions. Another had 52. Men and women were asked different questions. Contrition was expected and was measured by tears. Missionaries The missionaries at the beginning of the 16th century considered the natives of the New World to be the world's most pure people, the most godly people on earth, because of their poverty and because of their lack of awareness of European sins, or their lack of inculcating European sins. For this reason, missionaries sought to keep the sin-filled Spaniards away from the people. All doctrinas in 1550 were declared Indian republics in which no Spaniard could stay more than 3 nights. Mission schools trained native scribes, clerks, lay workers, and spies. Missionaries refused to teach natives Spanish. Missionaries advocated for native rights, particularly against slavery and with the encomenderos. And they conducted all religious teaching in native languages. At first, only spoken Nahuatl and picture books, but fairly quickly also Otomi, Mixtec, and Zapotec. Incredibly, the Franciscan friar Andres de Olmos produced the first Nahuatl grammar book in 1547, the first Totonac grammar sometime before 1554, and the first Huastec grammar sometime before 1571. Several Nahuatl speakers had been taken to Spain in the 1520s, and they resided in the monasteries so that the prospective missionaries could learn Nahuatl before they came. By 1525, 3 years after Cortez has conquered the Aztecs, the Mexica, by 1525, the Spaniards believed they had crushed the cult of Huitzilopochtli, ending its human sacrifice and priesthood, and dismantling the pyramid shrines to Huitzilopochtli in the region's cities, such as the Templo Mayor in Tenochtitlan. The agricultural cults dedicated, another slide, to Tlaloc, Chalchitlicu, and the Pulque gods were still intact in 1600. These were the deities and the cults of the agricultural peoples. These agricultural communities were too widespread and the farmers too independent to do much damage to these cults of the commoners. The missionaries were constantly worrying that the natives were surreptitiously hiding their old cultic practices among the new Catholic ones, when they swept, when they wove, when they danced or sang or made offerings. It didn't help that the native pyramids were torn down and the same rocks used to construct a Catholic church upon the same foundations, whatever its orientation, thus incorporating the native landscape alignments that invoked native deities and sacred calendrics. This also violated the East-West alignment principle of Catholic churches. Perforce, the native stoneworkers, native painters, and native musicians adorned the new buildings and embellished the mass and funerals, all arenas for idolatry. A quick examination of a couple of the other shared theological concepts will reveal the slippery slope observed by the missionaries. Afterlife. For the Aztecs, death was the passage from this world to the disorderly underworld. The geography of the afterlife for all Aztecs consisted of several destinations for the soul: the western sky for women who died in childbirth, the eastern sky for warriors who died on the sacrificial stone or of a ripe old age, Tlalocan for those dying a watery death, and that includes some diseases like emphysema and pulmonary problems and drowning, and Mictlan for everybody else. The destiny was determined by the cause of death, not the way of life. Reincarnation, primarily through name and physical likeness, was anticipated. Those going to Mictlan spent 4 years traversing the 7 levels between Earth and Mictlan. The living assisted them during that time with annual food offerings, but after the 4-year transition, that relationship between the living and the dead ended. For medieval Christians, the geography of the afterlife consisted of heaven, purgatory, and hell. One's destination was securely tied to the life lived on earth. Roman Catholics believed that the masses died in a state of spiritual imperfection and had to go to purgatory first, where sins were slowly cleansed, primarily through indulgences bought by the living. A good death might speed up the process, and a good death meant suffering or agonizing sufficiently long in order to obtain some repentance and pardon of sins. Catholics could expect to spend an eternity in this waiting place, living a never-ending, and the living with a never-ending obligation to the dead in the form of these indulgences. In 16th century Mexico, the native infant who had gone to paradise was now perpetually placed in limbo. The earning or purchasing of indulgences, which were so important in the Catholic European experience, were denied to natives in the New World. Mictlan was cast as hell, and Tlalocan was absorbed into Eden. Communion. Eating flesh by Aztecs. And when I say Aztecs, I mean all of these lineages, not just the Mexica, okay? Eating flesh by Aztecs is depicted in codices and was done in a highly charged religious context during 3 religious feasts. Priests were the consumers among the Tarascans, while Mexica priests, merchants, and warriors consumed their own captives' flesh after ritual sacrifice. Rarely did the populace at large eat human flesh. Instead, they were given pieces of doughy images of the deities, Huitzilopochtli and Xochiquetzal, for instance, after consecrating with song and dances. They believed that it was the body of the god that was passed out, and it was received with great awe, fear, and weeping. For the 15th and 16th century Catholics, the sacrament of communion was thought to strengthen one's spiritual life and move one toward spiritual maturity. It was administered usually at Easter and only after confession, and frequently only the priest in Europe consumed wine. In Mexico, the Tarascans were the first to be given communion. These are the Purepecha or Tarascans over in Michoacan. The Augustinians were the most open to giving Indians communion and gave it much more readily to Nahuatls than to Otomis, believing the Otomis to be of inferior intelligence. Dominicans offered communion only to native members of the Rosary Brotherhoods, and only at Easter or when gravely ill. In general, Franciscans only admitted to communion a handful of Indians. No one was given wine, and tortillas were the host. The refusal to give communion to natives, which is considered the greatest gift, Catholic or Christian gift, the refusal to give communion to natives was condemned by popes and archbishops and theologians alike, although ignored. Next. Oh, you're here. Okay. From my perspective, the primitive church era in New Spain is largely one of a series of aspirational failures in 4 important ways. This one here, the failure to recruit Spanish monks. Many men who volunteered for the New Spain mission in the first 2 decades of the mission activity did it because they either wanted to further the goal of baptizing all the world's peoples before the apocalypse, or because they wanted to die a martyr's death. Missionaries in the New World in this first 50 years were gravely disappointed. Many of these men had joined orders in Spain that valued contemplation, brotherhood, silence, poverty, scholarship. None of that was possible in the New World except for poverty. Okay. Typically, 2 men were placed in each doctrina and were left to school the elite boys, marry, baptize, hold mass, see to funerals, and visit each visita, sometimes 3 a weekend. This is all on foot, carrying whatever food they could manage to drum up from the native population in their mission. In the lowlands, missionaries were dying from diseases. Next slide. The army expanded the Catholic domain at a ceaseless pace, spreading the orders thinner and thinner. The Mexican head of the Franciscans sent a mandate and a quota to the monasteries in Spain: send men to New Spain, but to no avail, as the Protestant revolt and news of the mission experience in New Spain deterred men, and the new Jesuit order, founded in 1536, attracted a lot of men who might have come to the Franciscan order instead. Franciscans had 80 monasteries in Mexico in 1559 and only 30 friars. The head of the Franciscans proclaimed in 1581 that all friars in New Spain needed to recapture their commitment to recollection and withdrawal, so he ordered the building of hermitages and removed the men from administrating sacraments, teaching, or visiting villages, abandoning many native communities. Neither the Dominicans nor the later Jesuits had the same focus on prayer and eremitic lifestyle as did the Franciscans. Next slide. The failure of the orders to maintain control of the religious life of the natives. The archbishops of Mexico. Catholicism is divided into secular priests who answer to bishops and archbishops and are funded by tithes, and the religious are those people who withdraw to cloistered or something like cloistered life. And they don't answer to an archbishop, a bishop or an archbishop, and they are funded by royal grants, by kings and queens, and some by businesses like beer and wax candles and things like that. The archbishops of Mexico, so representing the seculars, pressured the religious orders to hand oversight of native Christian life to the secular priests. Isabella and Ferdinand had given the religious life, control of religious life in New Spain to the orders, not to the seculars, with a promise that at some point down the line, the seculars would replace the religious orders in daily spiritual life. So the archbishops of Mexico, several of them in succession, pressured the religious to hand oversight of native Christian life to the priests, the secular priests. These men of the orders had long claimed that the secular priests, who in New Spain served the Spaniards, worked with civil authorities, and ran businesses, that the secular priests knew no native languages, had no interest in village life, had no interest in natives, and it would greatly harm the native population to relinquish their missions and their missionary activities to the seculars. Since the seculars collected tithes for living expenses, and at funerals, baptisms, and weddings, tithing would further impoverish the Indians. An order in 1574 finally elevated the seculars over the orders and guaranteed the seculars a salary. But many Franciscans managed to drag out the transition for another 65 years. Next. The failure to incorporate native peoples into the religion. And I'll go to the next slide. the Franciscans opened a school to train native men in 1533, Tlatelolco, and that's the church that you see overlooking the Aztec ruins of Tlatelolco. They gave up in 1574. Next slide. The Protestant revolt was met by the church with the Council of Trent, which lasted from 1545 to 1563. And the Council of Trent considered all the complaints that the German Catholics had raised and rejected all of them, reified the cult of the saints, reified marriage as a sacrament, even though it's not in the Bible, and came down hard on controls for keeping paganism out of Catholic practices. The impact of the Trent meetings in Mexico on missionaries and natives was profound. In order to stamp out the influence of native beliefs and practices on Catholicism in Mexico, Rome ordered a stop to all textual production in native languages, prohibited the handling of Catholic texts by natives, forbid all all native dances, songs, and music and festivals on church property or in doctrinas, ordered all artworks, carvings, murals produced by natives in the churches destroyed, and mandated only Latin Mass and Latin song lyrics. So the natives are cut out of understanding anything that's going on. And let's go to the next one then, the failure to convert. None other than Bernardino Sahagún, who oversaw the creation of the Florentine Codex, penned in his lament in the 1570s, "It seems to me the Catholic faith can endure little time in these parts. Of those who come to confess, very few respond properly prior to the confession. Thus we can be certain that though preached to more than 50 years, if they were now left alone, in less than 50 years there would be no trace of the preachings which has been done for them." And Rome seemed to recognize the same thing. The Inquisition, established in Europe to judge Catholic clergy, and then later any Catholic, was forbidden to try Native Americans after 1571 because they did not know enough to be held accountable. There are several real reasons for the failure to convert. The huge language barrier, the inability of too few priests to cover so vast a terrain, the complicated concepts, the dramatic exclusions created by the Council of Trent, the refusal of most religious to give communion to natives, nor would they give last rites because they felt the homes were too filthy. Another significant impediment to conversion was the change in 1583 from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar. The Gregorian calendar was all about bringing the calendar back into alignment with solstices and equinoxes, the very points of the sacred solar calendar that the Aztecs and other Native Americans were relying on. So now they're putting, for instance, John the Baptist smack dab on summer solstice. To all of these hurdles, we must factor in the huge population decline among the natives. At least 13 epidemics hit Mexico from 1521 to 1599, reducing 22 million people to 1.9 million people. This, in fact, caused what many scholars are now calling the beginning of race thinking, theorizing the failures of the brown body and why they succumb so significantly to these diseases. Many of the churches built between 1530 and 1570 were abandoned by 1590, lacking any significant native population to preach to or to tend to the church buildings through the brotherhoods. The growing population of Spaniards and blacks in the large cities of New Spain themselves needed missionizing. The people of each new mission, whether it be Germany, Scotland, Mexico, or the Philippines, found ways to ignore or combine or mask their prior beliefs, giving each region a distinctive Catholic flair. Catholic policies in New Spain of accommodation, protection, and ultimately abandonment ensured that new brands of Catholicism would develop among elite natives, farmers, and transplanted Spaniards. Not the Christian utopia, nor pure Catholicism that had been envisioned by the Spanish orders for the New World. And you can do the last slide. So, are there some questions?
I didn't realize you were finished. That was absolutely fascinating. This is really a very enlightening talk, and thank you so much. I don't have a gavel, but this meeting is adjourned.